JD Vance goes undercover as a homeless person to test a bank. U.S. Vice President JD Vance entered a bank, concealing his identity. But no one knew who he truly was. Within minutes, he would be thrown out, humiliated, and everyone would turn their backs on him. But what happened next was truly shocking. This wasn't just a test. It was an experiment to expose how the American financial system treats low-income people. The fancy reports from Washington didn't reflect the reality on the streets. JD Vance wanted to see it with his own eyes. He walked through the doors of Beverly Hills' biggest bank. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. Customers sipping coffee looked up, and the security guard became alert. It was clear he didn't belong here. His worn-out coat, ripped jeans, and dirty shoes. But what stood out most were the calm yet intense eyes. JD walked up to the woman at the counter, Marilyn, the most composed worker at the bank. With her flawless makeup and golden badge, she looked down on him. For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a slight smile, she spoke. "How can I help you?" There was a subtle tone of disdain in her voice. JD adjusted his bag and spoke clearly. "I'd like to open an account." Marilyn's smile faltered. Her eyes quickly scanned JD, and some customers whispered in the background. "Our minimum opening balance is $500, she said in a sweet but firm tone. The bank seemed to fall into a momentary silence. JD reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and placed it on the counter. The atmosphere in the bank changed. Snickers and laughs rose. Nearby, customers shook their heads. Marilyn squinted her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, organizing the papers, but her gaze was still fixed on the money. "I think you'll have to go somewhere else." JD's eyes shifted. A trainee in the corner of the bank was watching him. Clara. She wasn't laughing. There was unease on her face. But Marilyn's attitude didn't change. She moved her hand under the counter. The security guard started to move. JD felt the silence. Everyone was waiting for him to be thrown out. But he didn't flinch. Because this was only the beginning. Clara, pretending to organize the papers on her desk, kept her eyes away from Marilyn and the other staff. The bank was as busy as usual, but her mind was elsewhere. She still had the crumpled $20 JD had left. Who was this man really? Marilyn's smug smile, the mocking stares of the customers. Was the bank always like this? As Marilyn passed by, she leaned in slightly. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "Some people don't know their place." Clara nodded slightly, but didn't respond. The unease inside her was growing. Something wasn't right. The sunlight outside filtered through the glass. Her eyes drifted toward the door. JD must have left. But what if he hadn't? She felt a sudden urge. She set the pen down, took a deep breath, and stood up. Her heart raced. She didn't know what she was doing, but somehow she felt like she had to look. She walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Clara froze in place. Marilyn was watching her. "I need to organize some files," she said quickly. Marilyn furrowed her brows but didn't press her. Clara opened the door and stepped outside. The sun blinded her. After the cold, air-conditioned air inside, the outside felt stifling. She scanned the area in front of the bank. Had JD really left? No. JD was sitting on a bench in the park directly across from the bank. His hands were in his pockets, watching the people pass by. But his eyes didn't move. He was waiting. Clara's breath caught. The voice inside her told her to ignore him, but her feet were taking her in another direction. She walked closer. But what would she say? Sorry for throwing you out earlier." Just as she was about to turn back, JD looked up. His eyes met hers. A moment of silence. JD smiled, and in that instant, Clara didn't know what to do. Clara briefly responded to JD's smile, but quickly looked away. Was she doing something wrong? It wasn't forbidden to speak to a customer in front of the bank. But if Marilyn or the managers saw it, they'd start asking questions. For a moment, she thought about turning back. She could go inside and act like nothing happened. But that uncomfortable feeling inside her, it wouldn't leave her alone. She took a deep breath and took a few more steps. JD straightened slightly on the bench he was sitting on. "I'm starting to think you're following me," he said with a light smile. Clara shook her head nervously. "That's not it," she said, but she felt she needed to add, "It's just, I feel strange when you're here." JD tilted his head. "Strange?" Clara put her hands in her pockets. "Yes. When you walked in yesterday, everyone judged you. Marilyn, the managers, the customers. And I did nothing." JD shrugged. "Most people wouldn't do anything in that situation." Clara stayed silent. JD continued, "But you're different. I noticed that yesterday. You didn't see me the way everyone else did." Clara opened her mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. What did he know about her? But her instincts told her this man wasn't ordinary. Finally, she decided to say something. "Why are you here?" JD sighed softly, then looked down at the ground. "Do you think you'd believe me if I told you?" Clara squinted her eyes. "We won't know until we try." After a brief silence, JD spoke again. JD smiled slightly. "Do you think my being here is a coincidence?" Clara furrowed her brows. "What do you mean by that?" JD straightened up a little. "Maybe the system is more predetermined than you think." Clara's head was spinning. "Then who are you?" JD shrugged. "I'm glad you asked." "So, is this an experiment?" JD smiled faintly. "Maybe, or maybe I just want to see a truth." Clara's mind was completely confused. But JD hadn't finished speaking. "And you, Clara, you're the most interesting part of this experiment." Clara thought about JD's words. What did the most interesting part of the experiment mean? Was this a game, or was she really part of something bigger? She still didn't know who JD Vance was, but it was clear he wasn't an ordinary person. As Clara tried to deal with the uncomfortable feeling inside her, she glanced through the glass door of the bank. Marilyn briefly looked up from her desk at her. Had she suspected something? Clara should have turned back, but she didn't. "Do you really know how the banking system works?" JD asked. Clara furrowed her brows. "What do you mean?" JD smiled slightly. "You've been working here for years. Have you ever thought about who gets to take loans, who has their debts forgiven, and who gets kicked out?" Clara couldn't answer that question. She knew, but she had never questioned it. JD paused for a moment. His eyes drifted off into the distance. "When I was younger, I thought the same way. I believed that as you get deeper into the system, things could change. But then I realized, some doors are built to never open." Clara wasn't prepared for that statement. "Doors?" she asked, her voice unconsciously lowering. JD shook his head. "The important thing is how far you're willing to go to open them." Clara instinctively looked behind her as she tried to make sense of JD's words. Marilyn and the other managers had gone into the meeting room on the upper floor of the bank. JD squinted his eyes. "Do you know what they're talking about in that meeting?" Clara stayed silent. She really didn't know. But now, she was starting to get curious. JD stood up. "Maybe it's time for you to learn." Clara took a deep breath. There was fear inside her, but at the same time, a curiosity bigger than she had ever felt. She didn't know who JD Vance was, but the one thing she did know was that turning back was no longer an option. Clara knew she should turn back, but her feet wouldn't move. She was a part of the system. She had worked here for years, doing her job without questioning it. But JD's questions were forcing the truths she had ignored to hit her in the face. She looked at the meeting room on the upper floor. The managers were still inside. JD silently watched her. "You don't have to go," he said slowly. "But if you stay, you have to know everything." Clara took a deep breath. Instead of stepping back, she took a step forward. She returned to the bank building. When she reached the upper floor, she could see inside the meeting room through the glass. Marilyn and the other managers were staring at computer screens, and on the screen there was a report open. Credit approval percentages. But the numbers weren't fair. White-collar approval rate, 87%. Middle-class workers, approval rate, 6%. Low-income individuals' approval rate, 12%. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The system was shutting out the poor. As Marilyn stared at the screen, she shook her head. "We need to change these numbers. It'll stand out in the audit." Audit? Clara looked at the screen again, and in the top corner she saw a name. JD Vance. This was an audit report. JD hadn't come here to test the bank. He was already auditing it. Suddenly, everything made sense. Why JD was here, why he hadn't left. And Clara knew now that she was part of it. JD was right. There was no turning back. But the question was, what would she do now? Clara took a deep breath. The managers were still upstairs. Marilyn and the others were changing the data on the screens. The rules of the bank were clear. She could watch them and continue on as if nothing had happened. Or JD was waiting by the door. Clara didn't look away. This system had been this way for years, but now she couldn't undo what she knew. JD silently nodded his head. Clara made a decision, and instead of heading back into the bank, she headed for the door. "But I've noticed something. You still haven't subscribed, and to be honest, if this story made you think, if it's causing you discomfort, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe."